Okay, so the next study that we are looking at is by Baron Cohen et al. Okay, so when it says et al, it means that there has been 3 or more researchers. So if there's 1 researcher, it'll say the researcher's name. If there's 2, it will say the 2 researchers' names. So, for example, Loftus and Palmer. But if there's been 3 or more, we usually put et al. So Baron Cohen and all. Okay, so it's done in 1997. And it is looking at autism and something called theory of mind. Okay, so I'm just going to go through some key terms, through a bit of background, so make sure you make notes on the background information, and then we'll look at the study. Okay, so autism. So autism is a developmental disorder, and it affects the social functioning of individuals. So it looks at how individuals can have impairments in several areas related to their ability to function socially, communicate socially, things like that. So, if you have autism, you're on what is known as a spectrum. So there isn't just one type of autism, and everybody who has autism has that type of autism, if you will. What it is there's a spectrum. So when you're talking about a spectrum, it means a range, okay? So the autistic spectrum refers to a range of disorders which consist along a continuum from mildly affected to severely affected. Okay, so this is what your autistic spectrum might, look like. Okay, so it's a continuum. So a continuum means you could fall anywhere along here. So it's not categories. It's not you're in this category, or you're in this category, or you're in this category. It means that you could fall here, or here, or here, or here. So you could be anywhere along that continuum. Okay, so you could be mildly affected. So individuals who have things like high functioning autism and Aspergers are in this mildly affected region. Okay, so it might mean that you've got an average IQ or a slightly above average IQ. It might mean that you have some extreme ability in some area. So we have something called autistic savants who have like particular abilities, particular skills that they are incredibly skilled at. So like memorizing large amounts of numbers, or memorizing what a city looks like from above, things like that. But it doesn't actually really affect your learning in a particular kind of severe way. Whereas at this end of the spectrum, it's what's known as a severe learning disability. Okay, so this is where you'd find classic autism. So where your learning and skills are massively affected. Okay, so Asperger's syndrome is when an individual is at the milder end, if you will, of the spectrum. Now that's not to say mild end, that's not to say it's not affecting you at all. Obviously it is, but it's known as the milder end of the spectrum. So it means that they have problems with social interaction, but they have generally normal levels of cognitive development. Okay. So we've got high functioning autism and then Asperger's syndrome. Now, there's a concept called theory of mind. So theory of mind is having the ability to understand that other people have independent minds of their own. So it allows us to understand and predict what other people think and feel, basically. So I'm going to talk a bit more about theory of mind in a moment. Okay, but it's basically understanding that somebody else has another mind than you. They know other things than you. They've seen other things than you. They feel other things than you. Okay, so there's a few things that we're going to talk about when it comes to autism. So some of these we're going to look at in the lesson. So 500,000 people in the UK have autism, and boys are 4 times more likely to receive a diagnosis than girls. So the statistics of autism is that there are 4 boys for every 1 girl that has autism. Okay, and there's a number of things that people have linked to autism as a factor or a cause. So there's this kind of continuing debate about whether autism is caused by nature. So is it something that you're born with? Is it to do with your genetics or your neurological development? Or is it nurture? So is it things like how your parents raise you? Is it something that you've picked up in your environment, like a bacterial infection? Is it due to being around people who smoke? Or your mother smoking? Is it due to being in a place where there's lots of air pollution or where there's lots of pesticides? Or is it to do with something like your parent, like the age of your parent? So something that's within the environment. Okay, so you're going to research some of these in lesson, but there's a whole different argument there. But essentially, people who are on the autistic spectrum have what is known as a triad of impairments. Okay, so the triad of impairments, if you are on that spectrum, you have difficulties in these 3 areas. Okay, so you can have difficulties in social communication. So these are things like not understanding facial gestures, so like non-verbal communication. They may use a set of phrases repeatedly. They may have difficulties with verbal and non-verbal communication, and they may repeat what other people say. Okay. Social interaction is another area which may be impaired in. So that might be things like difficulty in forming relationships. They don't necessarily want to have eye contact or might not want to be touched. May have difficulty in expressing themselves to others, like I currently am. And the last area of your triad is social imagination. So you may find it difficult to imagine how others are feeling or wanting to engage in pretend play with others. Okay, so that's things like putting yourself in somebody else's shoes or understanding other people's perspectives or playing role play games like imagination games. So if you've ever watched any sort of programs or films with somebody who is on the autistic spectrum you might see a few of these things. So if you have, I'd encourage you to watch those again now and see if you can pick any of those things up. So there's things like The Undateables is a program which has raised a lot of awareness of people with autism and with Aspergers, and you quite often see things like having a set of phrases that they use repeatedly. Like I think there's a fella on there that says exactly all the time. So he'll finish a sentence and say exactly, and he'll say something else later on and go exactly. Even if nobody's responded to him, he'll have that phrase that he uses quite consistently. And things like repeating what other people say. So if anybody's ever seen Rain Man, there's a couple of scenes in there which really display that. Okay, so if you have difficulties in all 3 of these areas, right there in the middle, that's you. You'd be on the autistic spectrum. Okay, so don't necessarily go, oh, that's me, which a lot of students do. They'll say, oh, I don't like making eye contact, so I must be autistic. That's not the case. Okay, so you have to have some level of impairment in 3 areas. Okay, so don't self-diagnose is the lesson. So theory of mind. So if you lack theory of mind, it's known as a cognitive deficit. Okay, so this is Baron Cohen who conducted the study, et al. With his friends. So he suggests that problems with developing theory of mind can explain the social and communication problems. So if you struggle with theory of mind, if you have a lack of theory of mind, it can explain some of these things. Okay. So, like I said, theory of mind is the ability to recognise and attribute mental states, thoughts, perceptions, desires, intentions and feelings to oneself and to others. So it's about being able to understand that somebody else has got a different perspective on a scene than you. So if one person stood in one side of the room and another is stood in a completely different side of the room, they're going to see the lesson from a different perspective. They'll see different things happen than you. And it's about understanding that that's what they've seen and this is what you've seen, and they're different. So they haven't seen exactly the same thing as you. Or about understanding other people's intentions. So somebody hurts you, but they didn't mean to, it was accidental. But can you understand that their intention was to help you, not to harm you? So in order to interact with people in a, quote, normal way, you need to be able to understand how the things that you say might affect somebody, how it might make them think and them feel, but also understand the reasoning behind what they say. So if you come into the room and you're wearing a particularly ugly jumper, I might be thinking, well, that's an ugly jumper, but I wouldn't say, what an ugly jumper, because that'd hurt your feelings. So I might just go, is that a new jumper? It's a nice jumper. Something like that. And that's because I have an awareness of your feelings, and I have an awareness that what I say could affect you in this way. If I say, what an ugly jumper, you might take it as a joke, or you might actually have your feelings hurt by that. Now, somebody who lacks theory of mind might not necessarily be able to make that connection. So if I said, what a nice jumper, they might think, well, it's not a nice jumper though, it's a bit of an ugly jumper. And wouldn't understand that my intention is to avoid hurting somebody's feelings. Okay, so that might be one example. And I think sometimes, particularly in the media, you see people who are autistic and on the spectrum appearing to look like they hurt people's feelings. You know, you see that quite often in TV shows, and that's again having a lack of theory of mind potentially affecting how we understand the things that we say can affect somebody else. Okay, so there's just a couple of examples there. So there's several experiments that have been conducted to show that people with autism struggle to employ a theory of mind, so struggle to use theory of mind and develop it. Okay. So it's a really classic example I'm just going to run through with you. So this is the Salian test. Okay. So in the Salian test, you can do what's called a first order and second order theory of mind test. And this is what the Salian test looks like. Okay, so this is Sally, and Sally's got a basket. And this is Anne, and Anne has a box. So Sally has a marble. So she puts the marble into her basket, and Sally goes out for a walk. Now Anne takes the marble out of the basket and puts it into the box. So now Sally comes back, she wants to play with her marble. Where will Sally look for her marble? Okay, so this is a first order test of theory of mind. So it's testing whether you can understand somebody else's perspective. So can you understand the world in this scenario from Sally's perspective? So where will Sally look for her marble? Okay, so I want you to think, and I want you to just say it out loud to yourself right now, where do you think Sally will look for her marble? Okay, now, a normal 4-year-old child, and hopefully you, will correctly state that Sally will look in a basket. So that's the last place that she left her marble, in a basket, so she's going to look for her marble in her basket. Now, what we often find is that children with autism often say that Sally will look in Anne's box. So they struggle to employ theory of mind and understand things from Sally's point of view. So their awareness is that that marble is in that box. Okay, so they struggle to use theory of mind in the sense of understanding that Sally hasn't seen the scene that we've just seen, for lack of a better sentence. Sally hasn't seen the scene that we've just seen. So Sally doesn't know that while she's been out of the room, Anne's gone and taken that marble and put it in her box. Okay. Right, so if you're passing the theory of mind test, you're going to say Sally is going to look in the basket. If you are not going to pass the test, you say that she's going to look in the box. Okay, now the second order test is very similar, but then Sally comes back, and instead of asking where will Sally look, you ask where will Anne think that Sally will look. So in your second order test, you're not only viewing things from somebody else's perspective, but you're looking at that person's perspective of another person's perspective. So from Anne's perspective, where does she think Sally will look? Okay, so again, a normal 6-year-old child will correctly state that she'll look in a basket, because they know that Anne is aware that Sally doesn't know that she's moved a marble. But adults with Asperger's syndrome have also been shown to pass this test. Okay, so we're saying that adults with autism have a lack of theory of mind. And we've seen that in children with this Salian test. But then what we're saying is an adult can pass this test as well, even though they've got Asperger's or they're on the autistic spectrum. So does this mean that they have developed theory of mind, or does this mean that there's a problem with the test? Okay, now what Baron Cohen suggests is that there's a problem with the test. So he argues that passing this test, this second order theory of mind test, doesn't show that people with autism have theory of mind. It says that these tests are designed for 4 to 6-year-old children. So it only shows that adults with autism have the equivalent theory of mind as a 6-year-old child. So it's not showing that they have theory of mind, they have a good level of theory of mind, it's showing that their theory of mind is equivalent to that of a 6-year-old child, because they've passed it and a 6-year-old child can pass it. Okay. This is known as a Salian effect. Okay, so this test only measures as high as the theory of mind skills of a normal 6-year-old child. So that's the ceiling on this test, is the normal theory of mind of a 6-year-old child. Okay. So Baron Cohen suggested that different tests need to be employed in order to test whether adults with autism and Asperger's syndrome can actually use theory of mind. Okay, so there's some other tests that have already been designed for autism and for theory of mind. So Salian is one, but we've got some different ones. So HAP's Strange Stories is another. So HAP developed an advanced test of theory of mind. So it's called advanced because it's sort of trying to reduce that Salian effect. So children are read stories, and then they're questioned about the characters. Okay, so it's called HAP Strange Stories because it's like unique scenarios. So these stories have characters who will do things like they will pretend play, they will joke, they will tell white lies, things like that's a nice jumper when it's an ugly jumper. They will use figure of speech, things like raining cats and dogs. They will use irony. And these are called mental stories or mentalistic stories. So if the children had trouble answering the questions about the stories, then they were said to lack theory of mind when they're compared to match controls. So because these require you to use some kind of abstract thought, some imagination, somebody else's perspective, things like that, it requires a certain level of theory of mind. Okay, so Baron Cohen used HAP Strange Stories as well as developing his own test. So Baron Cohen wanted to create a functioning test of theory of mind for adults. Okay, so the tests that exist at the moment don't really function very well for adults. There's still that Salian effect there. So he had a few research questions. So would adults with high functioning autism, so people who don't have severe autism and Asperger's syndrome, be impaired on a theory of mind task designed for adults specifically? Would females be better than males at mind reading or at using theory of mind? So theory of mind is sometimes informally called mind reading. because it's requiring you to sort of like think about what somebody else is thinking, think about their perspective. So they thought that females were better at this than males, and this is a commonly held belief that women are more able to understand other people's perspectives. And then Baron Cohen also hypothesized that adults with autism will have a specific deficit of theory of mind. Okay, so they conducted a quasi-experiment. So it's a quasi because you've got an independent variable, which is the type of person. Okay, so they had 3 groups of people. They had adults with high functioning autism and Aspergers. They had normal adults, and they had adults with Tourette syndrome. And it's naturally occurring. Okay, so they all already were either on the autistic spectrum, or they had Tourette's, or they were normal. Okay, and then the dependent variable is measured. So the performance is a score on an eyes task. Okay, so Baron Cohen developed a brand new task called the eyes task to measure theory of mind. Okay, all participants were tested individually. It was in a quiet room that was either in their own home, in the researcher's clinic, or in the lab at Cambridge University. Okay, so sample. So we've got our 3 groups. So the first group, we have 16 individuals with high functioning autism or Asperger's. Okay, so we've got 4 of these participants have high functioning autism, 12 have Asperger's. There was 13 males and 3 females. And all of them were of normal intelligence. They were recruited through an advert in the National Autistic magazine and a wide variety of clinical sources. Okay, but the main bit is the advert in the Autistic magazine. Okay, then you've got 50 normal age-matched adults. Okay, so don't feel harsh about calling them normal. You have to call them normal. That's what they're referred to in the study. It means neurotypical rather than normal. There's no such thing as normal, but they're called the normal group in this study. So it means individuals with no neurological disorder. Okay, so there's 25 males, 25 females, and they were drawn from the subject panel of the university department, comprising of the general population of Cambridge. So there was no members of the university, but the subject panel drew them. Okay. And then you've got your third group. So this is 10 adults with Tourette's. Okay, so they were also age matched. So the sex ratio was 8:2, so 8 males, 2 females. They were all of normal intelligence, and they were all recruited from a referral centre in London. Okay, so all 3 groups ended up age matched. Okay, so obviously we're interested in the autistic group and if the autistic group show a lack of theory of mind. Now, we need to also know why we've then got 3 groups. So why have participants without autism? So you need to have participants without autism because they're a control group. So you always need to have a control group as a baseline whenever you do experiments. Realistically, that's the best thing to do. Because if you have a group that do not have the neurological disorder, or if you're doing sort of caffeine and memory, have no caffeine, that gives you a baseline of what theory of mind should look like, or what memory should look like when you're not using caffeine, things like that. So in this case, it's what theory of mind should look like. Okay, what level of theory of mind should you have? Okay, and we can use this to compare to the other 2 groups, and that tells us whether the other 2 groups are abnormal in any way. Okay, but why have participants with Tourette syndrome? So Tourette syndrome is a neurological disorder, and it's characterized by things like tics and sudden involuntary movements and vocalizations. So it's things like physical bodily movements, so it might be like a twitch of an arm, So you sometimes see people that have only physical tics, so it might be like tics, so it might be like a facial spasm, might be a tic, or I've seen people before that have tics in their limbs, so it might be that as a tic their arm goes in the air and then it won't come down for a little bit, and it's all involuntary, so they've got no control of that. Or it could be vocal. So often people think that people with Tourette's just swear, and sometimes they do swear, but it's not just swearing. So often it's things which are like inappropriate for the moment. So it could be things like swearing, or it could just be saying random words, but words that are relevant to that person. So I don't know if anybody watches E4, but there's a lady that presents for E4. She does the like the talking bit when you're introducing the next show. And one of her tics is she says Thundercats. So often she'll go Thundercats between things that she's saying. Okay, so it's not like a swear word, but that's a tic. It's involuntary. She's got no control over that. Okay. So the reason why participants with Tourette's were chosen was because they're similar to autistic participants in a lot of ways. So these conditions, they both affect social interaction, they're both developmental disorders, more males, rather than females have these disorders, but neither one affects intelligence. Okay, so I think people have tried to make comparisons before with things like Down syndrome, which can affect intelligence, whereas we know that high functioning autism and Aspergers and Tourette's have no effect with intelligence whatsoever. Okay, so we can't say that any differences are based on intelligence and just on these disorders. So theory of mind should affect only participants with autism and not Tourette's. So by comparing the two groups, we can see whether having a lack of theory of mind is characteristic of having autism or being on the autistic spectrum, rather than just having any neurological or developmental disorder. Okay. So in this study, 4 tasks are completed. In this study, 4 tasks. Okay, so we have a set of control tasks. So control tasks, similar to a control group, are looking for baseline measurements. So the control tasks here are to ensure that the participants with autism were lacking only theory of mind, and they're not lacking things like basic cognitive functions, so like basic intelligences, basic abilities. Okay, so the 2 tasks are gender recognition and basic emotion. So in the gender recognition tasks, participants are looking at photos and they're stating the gender of the person in the photo. Okay, the task controlled for face perception, perceptual discrimination, and social perception. Okay, so in other words, none of these things could affect whether they suggested that they were male or female. Okay, and then you've got your basic emotion recognition tasks. So again, they're looking at photos of faces and they're stating what basic emotion the person was feeling, identified by a psychologist called Ekman. Okay, so they had choices of things like basic emotions being happy, sad, fear, anger, surprise, disgust, and they're checking whether difficulties on the eyes task were due to theory of mind, and that being in lack, or difficulties with these basic emotional recognition skills. Okay, so those are the 2 control tasks. And then you've got 2 experimental tasks. Okay, so after the control tasks are completed, every participant in all 3 conditions completed these 2 experimental tasks. So we've got the eyes task. So the eyes task was developed by Cohen, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about how that's developed. So this is the test that they developed to see if it was suitable for adults. Okay, so it's a test of theory of mind. And HAP strange stories. So HAP strange stories we've already talked about. So this was to compare the results of the new eyes task to see if there was a link between the two. So we know that HAP strange stories test for theory of mind, but there is a bit of a Salian effect with it. So what we're doing is we're getting this eyes task in which we're saying there's no Salian effect, it's suitable for adults. So if participants struggle with the eyes task, and then they also struggle with HAP strange stories, we can be fairly confident that these two tests are testing the same thing. So we know that they struggle with HAP strange stories, which tests theory of mind. They're struggling with the eyes task, so we can also assume that that is testing theory of mind. And that is known as concurrent validity. So if participants struggle with one task, they should also struggle with another task that tests the same construct. Okay, the same idea. So, to summarise what we've said so far, you've got three groups, so high functioning autism and Asperger's, you've got a Tourette's group, you've got a control group, and you've got 4 tasks that they're doing. So you've got gender recognition, basic emotion, eyes task, and HAP strange stories. First 2 are control, second 2 are theory of mind or experimental tasks. Okay. So the eyes task. Okay, so we'll go through how the eyes task worked. So, in this test of theory of mind, they looked at black and white photographs of eyes for 3 seconds. So there's 25 pairs of black and white eyes. There were 10 by 15 centimetres, each was displayed for 3 seconds. Now with each photo, 2 words appeared. One was a target word and one was the foil word. So the target word was the accurate description of how the person was feeling. So if the person was feeling happy in that photo, the target word might have been happy. The foil word is incorrect. Okay, so the foil word, usually the opposite, might have been sad. Okay, so participants were asked which word best describes what this person is thinking or feeling. Okay, so participants had to choose what they thought was the correct word before moving on to the next eyes photograph. Okay, so they're looking at it for 3 seconds, got to pick between the target and the foil word. So there's an example of what it looked like. So which word describes what this person is best feeling? Friendly or hostile? Okay. So when it came to choosing the photos, so we needed to make sure that this was a valid test, that it's free of bias. So all these photos are collected from magazines. We had 4 judges, so 2 male judges and 2 female judges that looked at each photograph and decided on the target and the foil word for each one. Okay, now to make sure again that this is valid and that there's no bias, what we do is we've tested this on a panel of 8 other people. Okay, so they had to further agree on which word was the target and which word was the foil. You know, they were checking that the task was of appropriate level, that the words used, both the target and foil, are understandable, that they match. So this improves the validity of that task. Okay, so there's a couple of examples there of pairs of words that we use. So friendly or hostile, sad thought, happy thought, calm, anxious, sympathetic, unsympathetic, concerned, unconcerned. Okay, so just a few examples. Okay, so when the groups had taken part in these tests, they found that in the control tasks, all the participants in the Autism and Asperger's group scored highly in the control task, suggesting they had basic cognitive functioning. So, in other words, on these control tasks, there'd be no difference between the autistic and Asperger's group compared to the normal adults and the adults with Tourette's. Okay, but the group that has high functioning autism or Asperger's made significantly more errors on the strange stories task than either of the other groups. Okay, so when they're being asked questions about the strange stories, if you're in that high functioning autism Asperger's group, you're making more errors. Okay, now when it came to the eyes task, what we did was we took the mean score, okay, so the mean number that they got correct. So the mean score on the eyes task for adults with autism or Aspergers was 16.3, compared to normal people, which was 20.3, and adults with Tourette's, which was 20.4. So the mean score for adults with Tourette's was not significantly different from normal adults, but both were significantly higher than those with high-functioning autism or Asperger's. Okay. Now, remember, another question that Baron Cohen wanted answering was whether there was any basis to the commonly held belief that females are better than males at mind reading or using theory of mind. So, using the results from the control group only, so from the normal group, they got the following results. So the mean score on the eyes task is that the normal males scored 18.8 and the normal females scored 21.8. So normal females performed significantly better than normal males on the eyes task, but the normal males were still significantly better than the group with high functioning autism and Asperger's. Okay, so normal males don't have as good a level of theory of mind as normal females, but they've still got a better level of theory of mind than those in the high functioning autism and Asperger's group. Okay, now within the autism and Asperger's group, there was no significant correlation between IQ and performance on the eyes task, so we know it's completely separate from IQ. It's just to do with having autism or being on the autistic spectrum. And on HAP strange stories, no participants with Tourette's syndrome made any errors, but those with autism and Asperger's were significantly impaired, making many errors. Okay, so this study concludes that adults with autism had difficulty on the eyes task and made errors on the strange stories. So this suggests that adults, as well as children with autism, find it difficult to attribute theory of mind to others. So they lack theory of mind, in other words, struggle to understand things from other people's perspectives. Now, contrary to previous research with adults, these results seem to provide evidence that adults with autism or Asperger's do possess an impaired theory of mind. So unlike things like the Salian test, which says that adults with Asperger's can pass a second order theory of mind test, same as a 6-year-old normal child, this is suggesting, well, actually they've still got an impaired theory of mind test. Theory of mind level here. And as some of the high-functioning autism and Asperger's group hold university degrees and were all of normal intelligence, it is reasonable to suggest that theory of mind deficits are independent of general intelligence. Okay, so that is the study by Baron Cohen. So in your next lesson, what we are going to do is I'll check your notes. So there's quite a lot of information here, so you should have made quite a thorough notes. And I'm also going to go through the study with you again, and we're going to evaluate the study.